a device company. And we have Mr. Sanjay Murthy. He is a government secretary, joint secretary, and he works in information communication technologies and information broadcasting now. So with this panel, we're actually now we are able to start. So our discussion theme is Skill India to build Digital India. Now actually Digital India can support Skill India and Skill India can support Digital India. So when we were designing this program, we thought actually Skill India is the foundation of Digital India, Make in India, Startup India, all of the government initiatives. So Digital India has a very enabling role. The Skill India can supply resources for the Digital India, and Digital India also can enable skills development in the country. So that can create supply as well as the demand. Now we have Mr. Chandrasekhar. I'll request him to set the tone for this discussion. He will be speaking, and then thereafter we'll have a panel discussion among our other panel members. Thank you so much. We start the session.
From here or from there?
I think you can speak from here.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sahu, and good morning to all of you and to my fellow panelists. Clearly, we are discussing an issue which is of great importance, not just to India, but if one may be bold enough to say, which is important to the entire world for a few reasons which I will outline. This session is titled Skill India for Digital India, but as Vijay was suggesting, it could well have been Digital India for Skill India, because that is the basis for any massive program of skilling. At one level, I think we can certainly look at this as India's moment globally. Given some of the economic developments and given the demographic profile of the country, which has the youngest population in the world, with more than 65% being under the age of 35. But in the absence of skills, this demographic advantage could well become a demographic millstone. And if you look at the projections, by 2020, the projections are that globally there would be more than 95 million people who are unemployed and 85 million skilled jobs which will not find people who can fill them. These are some of the projections made by some analysts. And the question is this something which is an opportunity which we can step into? What are the issues, and what are we already doing about it, and are we doing it right? The question which really comes up is what are the kind of skills that are needed? How do we determine these skills? How do we actually skill people? What would be the role that the government would play? What would be the role that the private sector would play? And most importantly, in the context of this session, how does digital actually enable that to happen? And for digital to happen, the kind of skills that you need all across the country in terms of people who can use IT, people who can manage networks, people who can provide various different kinds of skills that are required. We've seen the entire innovation and startup ecosystem really exploding in India and capturing global attention. How does this also become an engine for driving Digital India by creating services and products which the country needs and which make life infinitely easier and simpler for people? These are some of the questions. Again, when you look at skills, I think it's a very important question as to what really the government should be doing and what can be done by the private sector, how effective the current efforts are, and I'm sure that, some of that would have been alluded to in the inaugural session as well. And how do we go about determining where the gaps exist in terms of skills, both globally and domestically? What's the mechanism of doing it? Do we go in for a mechanism where there is a plan, somebody decides that, this is the kind of skills that are needed, these are the kind of shortages, or do we move towards a more market-oriented approach where many of these things, as much of this activity is done by the private sector, and the government concentrates on a few areas which are perhaps critical and which may or may not happen entirely through private efforts. For example, things like certification. In a country like India, it's quite important that those certificates should have credibility and acceptability. And we are still in a society and in an environment where a certain credibility does get attached if there's a government backing behind it. Then there's a question of the quality of training which is administered. And again, we've seen that there are all kinds of institutions which come up, and many people who go to such institutions get all kinds of training, but then find that employers are not either recognizing them or not giving them jobs. So if you look at this whole ecosystem, you'll find three very different perspectives: the perspective of employers, the perspective of those who impart training, and the perspective of those who actually get trained. And this is three very, very different views. So perhaps these are some of the issues that we would need to discuss. I thought by way of opening remarks, I would just flag some of these issues. But being where I am, I can't also help adding one last point, which is that today technology has not only enabled mass training through MOOCs or massively online courses, etc., but it has also enabled a substantial increase or improvement in the quality and effectiveness of the training if you combine interactive programs which are done through electronic medium, and you also bring in techniques like gaming into that. Then it becomes fun, the quality improves, and you can actually measure almost automatically the quality of learning that is there. So how do we build all of these and take advantage of what we have going for us and move forward? I hope that we'll have an interesting panel discussion, and I look forward to these discussions with the rest of the panelists. I'm sure we'll get some interesting perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chandrasekhar. The foundation of actually Digital India, one of the key foundation is the telecom industry, the connectivity industry. And I will invite Sanjay to talk about both from the telecommunications industry perspective, and also from the device industry perspective, as he represents both the industries, to throw some lights on, during his experience, what did he feel? Because he built up this industry, what did he see, how the telecom industry skills got developed, and the devices industry, as the manufacturing is starting now in India, under the Make in India initiative, how is he seeing those skills requirements, and what are his experiences? Over to Sanjay.
Thank you, Vijay, and a very good morning to everybody who's here this morning. It was great listening to Mr. Chandrasekhar. He's always very succinct and direct in what he wants to communicate, and I resonate with a lot of stuff that he's put on the table. I must say that the last 16, 17 years, when telecom has really propped up in this country, one thing for certain that has happened is a rural empowerment of some sorts actually took birth in this country. The moment we were actually going towards rural India with only two applications, one was voice and one was SMS primarily, we saw even those two had a pivotal capabilities to change the lives and empowerment of fishermen, of villagers, of farmers, because suddenly they were empowered to communicate with each other, right? And the moment we added a little bit of strength to those two applications by way of GPRS and Edge, which are really narrow band data that was available to the people in every part of the country, you saw a multiplier impact coming through. Suddenly, a new set of industry, which was absolutely born in the rural part of the country, not in urban part of the country, actually began to take shape. Let me give you an example. Smartphones and smart devices are a phenomena of today. They're not a phenomena of 10 years back. But even 10 years back, when GPRS and Edge was available, you could see that there were businessmen coming out of actually agro-based businesses in rural India, where probably the youngest son or the youngest daughter thought that why can't, in the absence of smart devices, I load films and music and games on a chip that gets imported from China, which comes at fraction of a price, and give it as an added value-added service to the consumers who come to rural India. Great thought. Believe you me, nobody at Airtel or Vodafone taught them this. They learned this on their own, right? And then comes the skill to say, somebody who's never dabbled with a computer, somebody who's never dabbled with technology, how does he get it right? That's because I think most Indians have reconciled to the fact that the only computing device that they'll have on themselves is a mobile phone or a smartphone or a handheld device. I think that's a given now. And this got accepted in rural India way back, and businesses started coming up. When we first went and allied with IFCO to go to rural India, and they had a setup already over there, they started building content for rural India, where they could educate farmers through free voice messages, through free SMS messages, on animal husbandry, on crops, on crop prices, on diseases, etc., etc. And a whole new industry began to born. Why am I sharing this example with you? Because my belief is that what Digital India will do to the rural India is something that all of us do not even envisage today. My take is that as connectivity begins to get better in every part of the country, you will see there are whole new concoctions of developments and innovations that begin to take place locally, and bulk of them will be able to train themselves. It'll be a community that will come together, and they'll begin to talk to each other, and they'll begin to help each other, and there'll be better utilization of all assets and resources in those areas, and suddenly a boom will begin to happen. Not to say that the models that exist in urban India today will also see a follow-up and flow through into rural India. I'll be very surprised that with large connectivity, a Flipkart or a Snapdeal will not have a model for rural India. They're bound to have a model for rural India. They will all begin to see that market because that market is too large to be ignored. And, we were discussing just before we came here, government has a role to play as well. I would say the responsibility of creating that infrastructure for rural India has to come through government. Government has to enable that by way of permissions, by way of policy, and as Mr. Chandrasekhar very rightly said, by way of certification. At the end of the day, that content that needs to be mobilized to create skills in rural India needs to be created by somebody. Will it be curated by some to make it impactful for those local markets? There'll be enough curators available, believe you me, and market dynamics will drive those curators in the ecosystem. But the government will support it through a proper certification so that there's no abuse of content, so that the quality is maintained, so that people who go through those certifications have an opportunity for employment subsequently, which is very important in this country. Nothing comes without a certification. So you need to have some sort of a certification. And I think that standardization is better provided by government than by private sector. I believe the market dynamics are so strong in favor of rural India, and especially the rural youth. They will again play the same catalyst role that urban youth have played. For you and I, who were born in an era where probably we need manuals to understand devices, the newer generation doesn't need any manuals to understand any devices. So whether we like it or not, I think the whole ecosystem, the demographics, is getting divided into three categories. We've all been able to manage diversity in our own ways, and we have our own connotations around diversity. But I think in this digital world, the entire diversity is getting divided into digital natives, digital immigrants, and digital aliens. And I think These three will drive how things come up. And digital natives are going to play a rock solid part, no matter rural India or urban India, to skill India. Because they are the evangelists who don't need manuals, whose libraries are Wikipedias, who go and spend bulk of their time on these gadgets, and they are able to form and work in communities better than you and I can. And therefore, the moment that begins to happen, can you see the sea change that will happen? And skills will begin to happen. We don't even know how many nurses exist in which villages in this country. We don't know how many paramedics are there. We don't know how many Ayurved guys are there. We don't know how many homeopaths are there. And can you imagine if there was somebody who was going to link all these guys together and say you could move from one village to another, you could move from urban to rural because you are connected, and then the whole game changes. We will be able to utilize the talent far better, and then the real need to say who do we train, how do we train comes up on the table. We were also discussing a little while back to say, I think we've got too used to boxing numbers, say we need 40,000 technicians, we need 100,000, blah, blah, blah. I think this is a lot of cock and bull, because the real thing is that the market will determine what we require, and that the market dynamics will drive. It's a great participation between government and the private sector, where the government needs to play a role of an enabler, a role of a provider of infrastructure, and the role of quality and certification. I think if that happens, we are going to see a sea change with this Digital India, and Skill India is bound to benefit. I think they are both so interlocked that you can't survive without each other. Whether it's the chicken or egg, I don't have an answer to that. But I clearly see that Digital India is going to be a fundamental change in the way we scale India going forward and make India more productive and competitive globally.
Thank you, Sanjay. What Sanjay talked about, the digital literacy, which will happen automatically because of the intuitive and interactive kind of devices are coming up, and the curiosity of the people to use and learn. The other part of your last experience, Sanjay, I'll ask a follow-up question on devices side. If device manufacturing has to move from China to India, what preparedness we need from the manpower and skills perspective? Some light if you can throw on that.
Yeah, I think, Make in India and Indian manufactured products. I think this theory is like the 6 blind men and the elephant. Everybody has their own interpretation of what it means. And very many times it's misconstrued that assembly, which is only a screwdriver technology, is actually a Make in India formula. I think that's the least value-added activity, and no country made it rich, or no country created great employment by actually having the screwdriver technology imbibed quickly, although you might end up starting with that. My own take is that this requires a very fundamental shift from our thinking. And I take the example of China here. Take China, and we are not China, we are not walled garden. It's impossible for us to take a decision to say no Google, no Facebook, no nothing, and therefore we'll have our own ecosystem developed, and therefore there will be a Alibaba, there'll be an Alipay, there'll be a Taobao. They have their own ecosystem that they've developed. I think we have crossed that stage. We cannot wish and we cannot survive without these international guys being a part of it. But if we begin to conquer the software and the operating system aspects, given the constraints and given the fact that we'll work with international guys as well, I think there'll be a much bigger traction for the ecosystem guys to come here. The fun is when the chip developers, when the camera manufacturers, when the software designers, when the hardware designers begin to move their ecosystem to India. The day that happens, then you can say smart devices, for example, are truly Make in India. For that, China took 10 years. It didn't happen overnight. Are we going to take 10 years? We may not have that luxury. But can we do it in 5 years? Maybe possible. Let's give it our best shot, right? And this is possible because there's capability that exists here. Moreover, I think one of the biggest fundamental advantages that we have is that world has taken a complete risk by putting 95% of world's produce only in one country. That's a big geopolitical risk that everybody runs. And which better option than a country like India, which has a population of 1.2 billion plus, growing and large domestic consumption, and can be a great option other than China to actually de-risk the entire world strategy going forward. So I think we are rightly poised, we are rightly placed, but we need to think strategically to say, how do we bring those strategic elements into the country where we see the entire ecosystem at the higher end of the spectrum migrating to India, and not only the screwdriver technology? I think that's one. Second, no matter what, your biggest competitor is China today. Unless and until you benchmark every line item on cost and policy with China, you're not going to be globally competitive. So whether we like it or not, there is a short-term strategy and a long-term strategy. Long-term strategy, make sure you have a better control over the ecosystem. Short-term strategy, you be competitive with China, and Make in India will happen.
Just wanted to add a couple of points to what Sanjay just said, that if you, and I completely agree that you have to look at it strategically and you have to compare yourself with China. But if you look at where do we already have a certain competitive advantage as a country, then it has to be said that it is in the area of design, it's in the area of R&D, it's in the area of engineering, where today that's probably the fastest growing segment and a pretty high-end capabilities that exist. But the way that we look at these things, oh, that's IT. No, we are not talking about IT, we are talking about manufacturing. That's the kind of compartmentalization which we have, whereas the reality is that physicality of manufacturing, as we call it, hardly occupies 5 to 10% of the value chain in today's world. So I think in building this strategy, we need to look at the areas where we are strong and how we leverage that to get a foothold and become competitive with China. It's just our I would say good fortune, it's not through any planning, that we happen to be most competitive in those parts which are the highest value addition segment in many of the manufactured products, especially electronics. So just thought I'd leave that thought. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chandrasekhar. Actually, another industry which will contribute substantially to Digital India is actually IT, information technology industry. So Mr. Mohandas Pai, he almost like created one of the strong pillars of IT industry, Infosys, here in this country. He has seen it growing from few people to now, hundreds of thousands of people work there. And India gets its recognition as world IT superpower. That's one of the teams which has contributed the most. So now deriving from them, what they are talking about is like probably the technology talent and technology skills has a significant role to play, Mohan, in building the Digital India. So I like your thoughts in that regard.
Bijoy, what excites me about Digital India is going to be the biggest disruptor in India's history in the next 5 years. Let me explain. Digital India is about empowering 1.25 billion Indians with an ordinary device to connect to the world of the internet. The internet today is a platform where 6 billion people are connected. It connects you to a global marketplace, gives you access to information, removes the disadvantage and knowledge asymmetry that exists between people, and levels the field for you. What you need is a mobile device, which you have, which is very cheap. You need connectivity to 3G or Wi-Fi or fiber, which is happening now. And if you are there, you're part of this global economy. Let me give you an example. There is a fantastic silk weaver in Banaras. What does he do? The middleman comes and gives him the fiber, silk. He weaves 14, 15 hours a day, a month, and he gets 4,000-5,000 rupees. And the same piece of sari, or whatever it is sold for 15, 20, 25,000 rupees elsewhere in the world. Now let's suppose that he is connected to the global marketplace to a mobile device, a smart device for 3,000, 4,000 rupees. And he has his own web page. He puts it up, puts his design. I go there, tell him I want a design, we weaves, and I pay him 25,000 rupees. And he gets money through a mobile wallet right into his account. And for 1 month, his income goes up from 5,000 to 25,000. Now look, Digital India is about empowering people. All over India, there are artisans, there are weavers, there are people with special skills. They don't have a marketplace. Now you're connecting them to market, you're giving them access to market, and their speciality, bespoke manufacturing, is so very novel that is a fantastic value in the global marketplace. What he sells to me for $25,000, he can sell in the US for $50,000, $1,000, and all he has to do is ship. There's DHL to ship. So he connects directly. Just imagine what happens if everybody is connected. Lychees are, grown in Muzaffarnagar, right? Somewhere in Bihar. Huh? Muzaffarpur, somewhere in Bihar. Now, I want to eat a lychee in Bangalore. So suppose you grow the lychee, you connect me and you ship it to me and I pay you money. You make 3 times the money. And they're perishable, right? Now, in Bangalore, there are organic farmers who get double the price for the produce that anybody else gets because they're all connected. So this connected marketplace will disrupt the traditional supply chain, the middleman network, which takes money, both in terms of business and also in services. In services, there's a portal called babajobs.com. Have heard of it? They're all people who are drivers, housemates, everybody. The salary has doubled. So this is empowerment. This is Digital India. And that's what is going to happen. Then, what are the opportunities for people for skills? Now, there's a great opportunity, especially in education, there's a great opportunity in skill development, because everybody knows that if you speak English, you're a driver, you get 2 times what you get paid if you don't know English. And there are portals and there are businesses which teach people English. Just now, I think a company in Jaipur got some 65 crores because they're teaching people how to speak written English. And you need to know only 200 words of English to get this 10,000, 15,000 rupees. A driver in Bangalore with English gets 15,000 rupees. And a driver without English will get 6,000 rupees. Now, why is the difference? Because you can speak, you can communicate, and you're better off, right? So you can have a lot of certification programs on the web for people and deliver language courses, deliver skill courses to automation to some extent, which does not require a little bit of handwork that has to be done, and that's very important. And next, Bijoy, another big disruption is coming in education. And let me tell you how. We have 750 universities, 47,000 colleges, and 30 million young people in colleges. By 2030, we'll go to 70 million young people, okay? There are going to be 70 million people in colleges, and there's the largest number of graduates in the world, and we're going to have a GR 50%. Now, education has 2 components. One is a regulatory aspect. There's a curriculum, there's an academic council, there's an examination, there's a pedagogy, there's a MHRD who tells you what degree to have, what not degree to, everything is there, okay? That's not going to change for the next 50 years. Because it's control from Delhi and Delhi wants control. There's a process of learning. How do I go to class and learn? I go to a class, there's a lecturer, teachers, lecture, projects. The process of learning is disrupted. Now, there are many people who offer you learning to rich multimedia, bespoke education, differentiated learning, where they deliver to you with quizzes, with assessments, everything that you want, asynchronously. So you can study at 12 o'clock in the night, 1 o'clock in the morning, you can do whatever you want. The learning process is disrupted. Now, the learning is disrupted. And the learning is disrupted, the huge business coming. So I can do physics 101. By the end of the year, I can do physics 108. Whereas I can do maths 101 and I can just finish maths 102 from examination. So when the process of learning gets disrupted, that creates a huge industry. And this industry is one of the largest in India. It's about, I think, 4 to 5% of GDP. And the whole process of disruption means skills get developed. That means the challenge you have of college graduate not having skills can be solved without the government. Because they're not going to change the regulations. All right? Now, if I go to a BSc degree, why can't I do a BSc in plumbing? Okay, maybe I learn plumbing, I learn electronics, I learn something else, and I can learn it maybe 60-70% to a web-based delivery platform where I can see somebody working, I can simulate somebody working, I can screw up somebody, I screw up something that is working there, and everything that can be done, 80% can be simulated. And when you have virtual reality coming in the next 2-3 years with artificial intelligence and machine learning built in, it means that the machine and I become part of the same seamless flow where the machine learns what I need and comes back to me. And just imagine, all this is going to happen because of disruption, because of innovation, because of startup, which are already happening. Maybe you don't know about it. And all you have to do now as a Digital India, keep the government away. maybe reduce the friction to business. Like Mr. Chandrasekhar said, certification should be done independently so that, there's a commonality of standards, the commonality of quality, and the rest of it, like Sanjay said, leave it to market forces, and the disruption happen. When the disruption happens, we are going to get 900 million people are going to be empowered. Now, 300 million people, the educated middle class, 900 people come to the marketplace. Just imagine what could be done. A new world is going to happen to digital India.
Thank you, Mohan. So, information and broadcasting, Mr. Sanjay Murthy, will have a very, very important role. It has a mass reach. How do you see, all the thoughts we got from the panel members can actually reach out and benefit the people there in the rural areas, and what are the government initiatives? I'll request you to throw light on that.
Thank you, Mr. Sahu. In my presentation today, I'll just restrict to this area that I am currently working on, which is concerned with the Media Entertainment Skill Council that the FICCI is spearheading. The work in the animation, digital gaming, visual effects, and comic sector, where the growth has seen a double-digit growth, there is a need for standardization, certification, and bringing world-class standards of the standards brought in by Sheridan College of Canada or the likes of that to be implemented in a country like ours. Now, this is part of a budget announcement made by the finance minister in his budget speech to set up a national center for excellence in this particular sector, in animation, gaming, and visual effects. We earlier had an attempt to do it in a PPP mode. We couldn't get a PPP partner, but now with this MESC having been constituted by FICCI and the industry body fully backing this organization, we propose to come up with an alternative of how these standards and how these certification processes and what type of best practices should be brought in, such that this has a connect with not only the small type of training programs that are being conducted in this, but how do you reach out to universities such that the syllabus also get appropriately aligned to take care of this type of needs that the industry requires. The budget has already placed around 50 crores available for being spent for this purpose. We are awaiting a DPR which the MESC is being mandated to prepare, which will define the contours of how this arrangement would be worked, how would this academic council be constituted, what is the governing structure to that. In collaboration with the industry, it wouldn't be a body which is absolutely a total government body, but a one in which we work with the industry. I'm very confident that this report that they are working on would give an appropriate structure. The government on its part would be committed to providing the land, the budget, and the infrastructure required for this purpose. And the operational part would be by this body that has been designed. Hopefully, it would get operational very soon, and that we would move in the right direction in the process of certification, standardization, and playing a leadership role towards harnessing the needs that the industry is expecting in this sector, as the chairman had just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sanjay. Coming back to Mr. Chandrasekhar, sir, you have the complete view from the government. Now you are leading the NASSCOM, which is an industry body, which is actually one of the most respected technology industry bodies in the world. How do you see the convergence of, say, information broadcasting from the media angle, the telecom devices angle, the information technology angle? How do you see they all support Digital India per se, and how do they reflect whatever the skills required for Digital India is developed in the technical education system and the curriculum and the skills building ecosystem that is there in India?
I think, first of all, we are moving more and more towards a convergence in terms of the pipe, where everything, whether it is entertainment, whether it is voice, whether it is data, all of them are converging through the same pipe. And the same is happening with the devices also. And the reason you do some things on your mobile phone, the reason you do some things on your laptop, and the reasons you do some things on the TV have nothing to do with what is actually available. All of them would be available on whichever device you choose, and which device you choose is a matter of convenience, it's a matter of your mobility, and so on. So as we get into convergence at the carriage level, and I believe that there are moves afoot to bring about higher degree of convergence and provide the legislative and regulatory framework for that. Much of it has happened even without that. But if you look at even the content, again there is a convergence, and the disruptive technologies which in fact Mr. Mohandas Pai referred to are breaking down barriers and breaking down silos and forcing a convergence between areas and disciplines which actually have never worked together before. So if you take something like skilling, the boundary line between skilling, between education, between animation and virtual reality, which is also referred to by Mr. Mohandas Pai, and between gaming, all of these are converging and coming together. And when they come together in creative ways, then the impact of that is far, far higher in producing the kind of skills which are required. These dynamics are too complex and changing too rapidly for any government to try and figure out, and much less anticipate what is required. So I think that's the point perhaps which Mr. Sanjay Kapoor was referring to, where he says, look, there's enough creativity out there in the world. We have a lot of digital natives for whom this creativity is a fact of everyday life. So in all of this, the ability to actually bring these different disciplines together in creative ways to meet a need which is felt, I think that is a very critical element. And I think that how you exactly identify what are the minimal set of things which government needs to do, and what are the things which can be best left to the private sector. And as the private sector continues to grow and occupy a larger and larger slice of the national GDP, it only makes sense to ride as much as you can on the private sector as possible. I am not one of those who believes that the IT industry grew in India, in spite of the government. I am not also one of those who, certainly not one of those who believes that the government is really responsible for the growth of the IT industry. But I think it was critical in that case that government did only the few things which it had to do and then stepped back and allowed the industry to do the rest. And the industry was fully poised to do its thing. And I believe that we have reached that level of maturity where it can do the same thing in many other areas as well. So I think this is the scenario that we are getting into, and perhaps that is how we should look at it, and look at regulation more as an enabler rather than a controller of this massive change which is happening. How do we enable that change to happen? I'll just give one more example and then conclude. You've seen in the case of payments, for example, every day we see a new kind of application, a new kind of device, and a new kind of service which is coming up. And each is a little more useful, little more accessible, little more convenient, little faster, little more secure, whatever. And the point is that does the regulation allow these new solutions to gain traction as quickly as the people want them? Are there any barriers there which are preventing it from coming in? We've seen the kind of traction which e-commerce got. But the other side of the same picture is that we are seeing the regulatory maze into which they are getting into, whether it is in terms of taxation or whether it is in terms of regulation of what they sell and who is responsible for it, or in the from the point of view of investment. So I think it's very important that those enablers which are part of government policy and which will always perhaps remain a government domain. Those should, I think, be looked at on a continuous basis. The pace of change is so fast that you don't have the luxury of making a law and sitting back for 150 years as we've done for the Telegraph Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chandrasekhar. You know, digital India, when everything gets connected, so it throws open a very big risk of cyber security, and that needs preparedness, that needs skills. So what do you think, Mr. Chandrasekhar, what kind of preparedness the government is thinking of, the industry body like NASSCOM, who is in the forefront of technology, is thinking of?
In fact, you know, the point that you have raised is very, very pertinent, because people recognize that the one thing that can really spoil the party as far as digital India is concerned and as far as the march of the IT industry is concerned is this whole concern around security. And I think we recognize, and NASSCOM as a body and the IT industry recognize, that our footprint in the area of cyber security is not commensurate to our overall footprint in the IT sector in the world. And India as a country perhaps has a fairly high vulnerability at this point in terms of cyber security. So much so that, you know, when we had an event on the 1st of March to mark 25 years of NASSCOM, the Prime Minister was the chief guest at that event. And he spent the longest period in his address, significantly longer than any other thing that he touched upon on cybersecurity. And what he said was in some way not only music to our ears, but something which we had been thinking of, which is, why can't NASSCOM actually set up a task force on cybersecurity to see what can be done to make India a global powerhouse in cybersecurity and become a key enabler of secure cyberspace. So we've actually set up that task force, and you know, there have been there's a lot of work that has been done in terms of what needs to be done at the level of the industry, what needs to be done at the level of skills, what needs to be done in terms of policy, and what needs to be done in terms of technology, whether you take something like encryption or you take something like devices. So there's a whole report which has been drawn up, where a set of recommendations have been made on what all needs to be done and what all the industry can do and should do and what the government can do. This perhaps may not be the time or the place for me to share all those details, but I think that is going to be presented to the government very shortly, and we hope that can make a big difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chandrasekhar. Friends, you must have noticed like this panel has more answers than the questions I have. Now I'll take your help. If you all have any questions, please raise those questions, and this panel will have many more insightful answers to give. Thank you.
First of all, let me compliment and thank the panelists who have given a very broad outlook of how do we move about in this area of skill development. There are three entities which are required when we look at this skill development mission: the academia, the industry, and also the other important stakeholders who is aspiring to become a skilled person. Now in this, how do we connect all these three? There seems to be silos today. The academia doesn't know what are the skills to be developed, or what are the skill set which are required, or competence required. And then the industry doesn't know that where do we go and how do we define the skill set and then project the requirements. That the person who is actually going to be a skilled person doesn't know whether he has that aptitude to pick up that skill. The aptitude, the interest, and the potential to harness that skill. So how do we, what are the strategies we should adopt to network, connect, and then have a holistic picture so that we succeed? Because it's now currently there's a big gap between these three. So I would like the panelists to throw light on this.
Sir, you'll be amazed at the innovation that's happening at this intersection. You'll be totally amazed. Education is half disrupted. In 5 years, it'll be fully disrupted. And our academics don't know about it. I'm serious. And as far as industry is concerned, industry is finding more and more that there are many startups, many disruptors coming and helping them get the skill they want because they're connecting people to markets. And there are individuals who are trying to find out what is required. There are assessment tools, there are aptitude tests and all kind of tests available here, and it's just scaling up. I'll give you one instance. There's a startup called Online Tyari. You've not heard of it. 2 million people do tests in Hindi and learn how to go to government jobs to pass the test the government holds. 2 million in Hindi. You don't know about it. Now, like I said earlier, if you're in education, your student is probably taking more courses from outside than taking with you. Of course, he's paying you a very high fee for sitting in your class. But when he goes out, he knows the skills that he wants are not what you're going to give. So as academics, you must find out who are these innovators, what are they offering, see how you get on board and connect them to the students, because you will not be able to do that innovation. The market and innovation has gone far ahead. And employees are now going and surfing. Just the other day, I had a startup which came and told me how they're going to choose employees with the correct aptitude so that the percentage of people that to get through jobs, because you match both the individual and the corporate need, it'll go from maybe 5% to 25%. They crack the problem through a very great algorithm. And that's happening. And people are also finding, let's say, I'll give an instance in IT, everybody needs great coders, right? Now there are coding competition having on the web. So you put out a coding problem, I come and compete, I write a code, and my salary goes up double because there's a company which wants this great skill. The market is being created and disrupting the traditional HR structure. And it's all happening asynchronously on the web. So there are many, many things happening. It's happening. It's maybe you're below the radar, but I think you should watch out and see how you become a part of this.
Yeah, I think I can just take a minute to just add on to what Mohan's just said. I think ideation is happening everywhere, in all stakeholders, despite of a belief amongst us that they are working in silos. There's ideation happening everywhere, right? What brings the ideators together and what brings down those glass walls, if there are any between them, is sustainability of an idea. The moment an idea becomes sustainable, then there are guys who want to put money behind it. There are industrialists who want to make sure that they reorganize themselves to be there where there's money to be made. And I think the whole ecosystem comes together. So I think the change, as he rightly said, is happening at such a fast pace that many of us don't even know. I mean, I can quote my own example. It's the funniest thing that can happen. It is just about a 10-day-old news. I decided to step down as the chairman of Micromax and move on. And believe you me, the first people who came in touch with me did not come to me through a friend, or did not come through me to a headhunter. They located me on LinkedIn, right? And they located me on LinkedIn, and before I realized, I had a ticket in my hand, and they said, fly down to the country where we are and let's have a chat. Right? So the world's really, really keeping an eye on the whole ecosystem. It's contrary to our belief that we are not being watched. Once you are on a dynamic, electronic, digital media, you are being watched, right? And everybody's watching you, whether you've seen it or not. So I think that's what will collapse the walls and brings everybody together.
Let me give Sanjay's example once again. WhatsApp, 5 years back, 900 million. They took business away from him. The poor guy. All the SMS traffic is gone, he's free, and they're cluttering it up, and he's now asking, give me a congestion charge, net neutrality has got a different debate. Look at the innovation. Yeah. So the amount of innovations happening in every part of our life is enormous, and it's going to disrupt many things. I'll give you another example. Somebody did a 3D printing of a car. 3D printing of a car. Not through traditional manufacture. Somebody has done 3D printing of an aeronautical engine. They're 3D printing houses. So you don't have to lay bricks. The brick wall, I don't know what it's going to do. It's still small, right? They made 3D printing of parts going into the body for joining for your limbs, for your hip thing. They're also doing 3D printing of chocolates. So the innovation, sir, is there. Just watch out and become part of it.
I think this is a very powerful one, and those of us who are very close see the problem. For 25 years, the telecom industry, not in India, globally, was only milking the cash cow. And they were milking voice, and they were milking SMS. right? And they made tons and tons of money and big EBITDAs and big investments out of that. The cheese has moved. Somebody else moved the cheese. That's what happened, right? And there are WhatsApp and there's FaceTime and there is Facebook and there's LinkedIn. This is for real, right? The industry could have kept all this amongst themselves by breaking their own paradigms. They didn't. So somebody else has. This is going to happen in every single industry, whether we like it or not.
Right. Can I extend this question a little, to Mr. Mohandas Pai? It's very, very interesting debate going on. So how you see the future of these 750 universities and 25,000 colleges in India? Because everything is being disrupted continuously. Everything is on the MOOC now. So anybody, any student can from anywhere through his smartphone can go to the MOOC and can learn all those things. So what do you see the future of all these?
Embrace the change, lead the change, let regulations lie as it is, and focus on learning outcomes. Because learning outcomes is where the change is happening. Regulatory thing, don't fight the battle. So check up when a student goes out, what are the things that he'll have? The best education in the world, flipped classroom, the way you communicate, the way you give courses, let him take courses on the MOOCs, let him do skill development courses, get people who provide that, make them as partners, get a small part of the revenue and improve it so that your placement becomes much better. You beat the hell out of everybody.
I just wanted to add one point.
Yes. A follow-up question on the same point. In 5 years' time, how will a school look like? A school exist? In 5 years' time, what will a college, university look like?
School will exist. There'll be teachers because you need human intervention. That will always remain, and you need that. But I'm just saying, imagine there are 263 million kids in school, okay? Up to class 12, I think. Imagine every child in India has a tablet with rich multimedia content, with rich audio, with 3G and Wi-Fi. That kid is now part of this global community. Many, many geniuses will come because they're depriving a kid in the village of good education. They will learn Hindi, they will learn English, they will learn everything. 30-40%. Not everything, because teachers are required. And the teacher becomes a mentor. And teacher also teaches using all that content, because content and delivery is important. Just look at that empowerment. You can remake society. You can change India in 5 years like nothing else. And you can be part of the journey. And the kid today has got access to Khan Academy, where they teach you very nice maths in Hindi. We translated Khan Academy into Kannada and all Indian languages. Translated to Indian languages. Content is available. So look at the multiplier impact that has. So embrace the change. Use all that. Partner, because you cannot do all that innovation. So you are an institution. Embrace that and you can see the change.
Wanted to mention that, I have sort of got all my grey hairs before I actually lost them in trying to build partnerships. In partnerships between educational academicians and the industry. Trying to bridge the gap between the kind of skills and trained workforce that the industry needs and the kind of education that is being imparted. And they're very, very different perspectives, because if you take the classic academicians, they feel that our job is not to impart skills. We are here to impart knowledge. And once they have the knowledge, they will be able to pick up any skill at any time, because skills are transient, knowledge is permanent. At least that's their view of the world. And for the variety of reasons, that is entirely within the regulated sector, the formal educational sector, with classes, schools, timelines, etc., etc. But it's a universally recognized pattern. Everyone around the world knows what a graduate is, a postgraduate is, a PhD is, etc. But the non-formal part of it, which is subject to this cataclysmic change and this blistering pace of change, is moving at an incredible speed, which it is completely impossible for the formal system to keep pace with. And the balance between how much of formal and how much of this is also shifting in favor of the non-formal part. So you'll probably still always have some formal part where people will still want to know whether you have a graduate degree or a postgraduate degree or a degree in some discipline up till some point of time. But the kind of avenues and opportunities, and we heard all of those different things, both in terms of how people are contacted or how people receive their education or how they receive different kinds of skills. So we will see this combination happening. And today we are in a situation where people who are employed, it's not just a question of fresh entrants being skilled appropriately. People who have done 5 years also are rapidly finding that they are perhaps becoming less relevant with every passing year. So the importance of non-formal as a continuing part of the process of skilling oneself will continue to grow, and therefore I do believe that many of these which are real world skills, like teaching English to cab drivers for example, are going to play an increasingly important role, but will coexist, and the formal structure will continue to be controlled by the government and will continue to move much more slowly than what the market would hope for.
Let me challenge Mr. Chandrasekhar, okay? Just imagine a world where you have a BSc physics degree. What is the value of the certificate? It's a signaling device. Signaling to an employer like me who says, okay, this person has got a BSc physics, he must have learned a little bit of physics, blah, blah, blah. So, there is some backing. Now, I say I'm going to ignore this BSc physics. I'm going to have a test for people to come on my portal and answer all the questions and write out a test to understand the knowledge of physics, and I'll do it with the degree. Degree not required. Just come and pass my test, and if you're able to pass it, know it, come in and I'll give you a job. You bypass it. In the IT industry, we had to train everybody. Mr. Chandrasekhar knows that, right? Infosys spent 1,200 crores a year training people, create the world's largest corporate university. I'm sure many employees did that. Why? Because, the degree that you got didn't give you the skills. But we're scared to do away with the degree because worldwide people want the degree. Now, suppose tomorrow small companies come and say, I don't want a degree, I only want this skill, and you can go learn the skill on your own and come, and I'll give you a test, you pass it, you get it, and then you do very well. Why do you need that? No, I'm just putting the idea. We all need a degree because, you'll not get married or some, people will not marry you and all that if you don't have a degree, certificate and all that. But just think about this because earlier days, it was a signaling device. It meant something. Does it still have the value that it's supposed to have in a formal way? Just like Mr. Chandrasekhar said, the informal could disrupt the formal, may not be significantly, maybe 10, 20%, then the world changes.
No, I agree entirely, and I think that is certainly the direction in which we are headed. And over a period of time, we may well reach that situation. It won't happen overnight. So I would strongly advise those of you who have kids not to tell them to forget about their college and get out and learn only skilling. Yeah. But we are, I think, moving certainly in that direction. It'll be a while maybe before people say we don't need it.
Can I have a question?
So I'll just make another important issue. See, I have been a part of government for 40 years. I was with the DRDO as Chief Controller R&D. And then I moved to now Amity University for the 2.5 years. So I'm looking at the private sector. What are the government initiatives in skill development to harness this great potential? Manipal Group is there and a number of institutions. What are the enabling processes, mechanism to promote, strengthen, nurture, and also handhold the private sector in terms of this national skill development mission? So what are the enabling processes, mechanisms available, ecosystem which is being created by the government?
Maybe Mr. Chandrasekhar should take that question.
Frankly, I was hoping you would turn to somebody else, but I think that one of the hopes in bringing in private institutions into the education space has been that they might do a better job of being nimbler in terms of adjusting their academic schedules within whatever degrees of freedom, all this setup of AICTE and UGC and all that offers. And that they would be better equipped to bring in the skills required to teach them, because even if you, for example, just change the syllabus, you have to also get a teacher who knows how to teach that particular subject. So certainly the expectation is that some of these institutions would be able to do that better. But I think many people suspect that the combination of the private institutions and the kind of regulatory structure we have has not necessarily led to many of these institutions doing that. There are some shining examples of institutions which have done exceptionally well, some of whom are on the panel. But there are enough examples of the private institutions which have actually reinforced the idea of tighter regulation and greater control. But the very mechanisms of control may in themselves be responsible for some of these aberrations. So to come back to the question of how do you actually strengthen these private institutions, I think that even in the skilling program that we are currently undertaking, much of these skilling programs are being administered in the formal educational institutions, in the evening, in the morning. It doesn't change their degree in any way. It doesn't even appear as a line on their degree, but it's a separate certificate which they get. So those who think that this skill and this non-formal education and this certificate will help them to find a job, they come in for that. Or some of them come in just in order to get the knowledge and the skills required. And the same is in fact much more easily available to the private institutions who can piggyback on some of the skilling programs which are currently underway.
Can I ask
Thank
a question?
you. Actually, we are done with time, because if we answer any more questions, it will be between the lunch, and that's not a good thing to do. You know, when we started design this program, we thought like Skill India will help Digital India. Now it looks like Digital India will be the foundation of Skill India.
Till 1:15. We got 15 minutes more.
So okay, we have 15 minutes more. Thank you.
Sir,
So
I
you
have a question.
just,
Mr. Pai.
Yeah. Okay. 1:15. Yeah.
Should I? Can I go? I'm here. My name is Sanjay Shibnani. I vocational business in India. My question, I'm afraid one too many, is again directed at Mr. Chandrasekhar. Sir, you know, NASSCOM's ITS Sector Skill Council, we've created a number of QP NOSes, national standards for various job roles. And these have been created over the last 2 years now. And vocational training providers like ourselves are deploying and via these national occupational standards. Do you think Digital India would therefore mandate, and should it, and how fast, should it mandate a refresh of the QP NOSes? Because we will have to tag them to Digital India. If Skill India is going to be central to that, then you may have to refresh and recalibrate the QP NOSes. So I'm just wondering if that, I'm sorry, an academic question, but...
No, I think absolutely. The short answer is absolutely, because that's the reason why the Sector Skills Council is sort of administered by a governing council, which consists entirely of industry representatives who manage the HR in the industry. And the frequency of updation of the QPs and the NOSes is very much a part of what they would be looking at to keep pace with the changes that are needed. In fact, there was a whole discussion in the last governing council on this very issue as to what should be the frequency, and you'll be happy to know that it was not in terms of even years like you were thinking, but even whether it should be less than a year.
My question is to Mr. Chandrasekhar regarding the cyber security. I'm here. My name is Dheeraj Berry. I work with a company called Meritrack. For some time of my career, for around 6 years, I have worked in the security space. And let me tell you, in India and for Indians, security, any type, IT, cyber or physical, is accidental and forced upon. Until and unless somebody breaks into my house, I will not employ a chowkidar. One. This has happened to the banking industry where I was servicing the security needs. Until and unless the biggest bank of India, I will not like to name them, in the private space was hacked same day thrice by the same IP address, they did not realize that how important the cyber security is for them. Before that, they thought it's an expense. They said it's an expense. But when they were hit thrice the same day, they realized that this perception, this threat is imminent. One. That point of time, SEBI and RBI made it mandatory for all banks in India to operate with a security gadget. There is a lock on the toolbar when you go into a banking site. That is the lock I'm talking about. You cannot operate your your site for your money transactions without this lock. Neither you can transact on your NSE or your BSC without that lock. So that was made mandatory. Until unless that move happened, everybody thought it is accidental. Until unless the chore does not come into my house, I will not put the chowkidar. So I'm talking about a big space right now, which is Digital India. Such a huge concept, such a huge dream. Cyber security in India will not happen until unless it is thrust upon. It has to be forced upon, because I really don't know how many of us will still think it's an expense.
Let me just mention that as in the area of cybersecurity, one of the reasons why the actual loss because of cybersecurity violations in India has been as low as it is till now is precisely because we didn't have too much in the digital space in comparison to most countries. And as we succeed in moving towards digital India, the problem will become more intense. But security is a function not just of technology, it's also a function of practice. And I don't think that practices can be forced on people. And you're right that you have to be bitten for you to take precautions. If you're living in a village which is perfectly safe, most people there don't lock their houses. But when thefts start, then people start locking their houses. When more thefts and dacoities take place, then you have guards. So there is a trade-off in the cyber world. There is a trade-off between how much of security and how much of cost and how much of convenience. You can have two-factor authentication. Why? You can have 10-factor authentication also, but it will become so inconvenient that people will stop using it. We can fall back to one-factor authentication, but then you lose the very reasons why two-factor came in. So this trade-off between convenience and security and what are the alternative ways in which you can achieve security, all this will go on. But educating people, making them aware is an important part of it. And a lot of what has passed off as cyber security breaches also are simply people not doing the right thing. People, responding to phishing requests, whether it is on the mobile or whether it is on the computer, and then losing a lot of money. So a lot of this, I think, requires action on multiple fronts. That's part of the cybersecurity task force recommendations, what needs to be done in terms of awareness, what needs to be done in terms of technology, what needs to be done in terms of policy. So, but I personally, my belief is you cannot force these things. You have to make people aware, and you have to enable them to know what they need to do in order to secure themselves.
Hello, I have a question here.
Just adding one more point to this issue. We are a mobile-first economy, and that is the more pervasive device that is going to be there in the hands. And with each passing year, that device is becoming more powerful than the computer that you probably owned 4 years back or 5 years back, and that's a reality. Today, when it comes to a laptop or a desktop, you have an antivirus and other softwares that you apply. But the moment it comes to a handheld, there is no security that you load onto that device at all. Right? Can you live like that for too long? I don't believe so. As the transactions go up, we in our first phase have only used these devices for information. The moment you move from information to transactions, if you don't securitize your devices, you are in big trouble. Right? So I think it will begin to happen automatically with this transformation that's hitting us. As we move to transactions, I think it is absolutely a death knell not to secure your devices and not to be aware of security.
One of the major pillars of, I'm Prashant Deshpande from Reliance. One of the major pillars of Digital India policy is e-governance, transformation of the government through e-governance. And I see this is an industry forum, and industry has a view that we are dynamic and government is lethargic. So, but if e-governance has to be really effective, government has to develop a lot of digital skills from within. Because unless the government employees who are touching the citizens are digitally skilled, the e-governance, the one whole pillar of Digital India, will not succeed. So you are as stakeholders, you must be interacting with government. We have two, one former and one existing senior public servants out here. Is government doing enough to digitally skill its own people, or something we should recommend to happen as the partners for government to do it? Because we all will be impacted if that pillar of the Digital India is not being taken care of.
Okay, I think Sanjay has followed the good tradition in civil service of passing on the buck to the senior. So I will respond on our joint behalf, if I may. So I think, as far as the government is concerned, first of all, I want to correct the first part. I don't believe that industry is dynamic and government is lethargic. Industry is dynamic, government moves more slowly for very different reasons, because each has a very different bottom line. So that comparison is perhaps, has to be looked at differently. But in terms of how do you make government, digitally capable, and what role does building the competency of digital skills among the employees play, you have to look at it holistically. It's not just as if tomorrow, hypothetically, everybody in the government individually was digitally literate. Government would still be the same, because they would be doing their private business digitally and their government business would still function the same way. So the question is, how do you bring in these digital systems, processes and practices in the government, and how do you skill the people there for that? Again, the question is, what skills? You did not make everyone an IT whiz in the government. And I do recall, for example, when the finance department in the state government in the late 1980s, some of you may gasp when you think that at that time departments were being asked to do things digitally. So at that time, the people in the finance ministry had to be trained to use the systems, people in the treasuries who were doing large volume of transactions. It turns out that if you have to train them to do the same function that they're doing manually in the digital mode, all it needs is at most a couple of weeks of training. That's it. A person who didn't even know what a computer keyboard was, 2 weeks. That's it. So once you have a proper system in place to train the people to use that system to perform the very same function, is a piece of cake, believe me. The difficult part is really bringing in those systems. And currently the model is that if you have large systems, then you have to design a project and then create an RFP and then follow a due process, which is always a challenge in the public sector. And in that process, the actual choice does get de-optimized. Second thing is, you're trying to procure something which you're describing on paper, which has never been done before, and then settling the commercials, and thereafter then trying to renegotiate what exactly you want, because government changes their mind, they learn something, the private sector imagined something, because many of them have taken a deep dive without even knowing how deep the pool was. And then it's a voyage of discovery for both sides, and often mutual recrimination also. People are learning on both sides, but the question also is whether there are alternative ways in which you can avoid such a very tortuous procurement process and enable some of the private sector dynamism to, in a sense, bypass or speed up this process of the project development using different techniques, whether it's a Swiss challenge technique or like Aadhaar has done, have an open APIs where value addition is done outside, but the core is done directly. So those are some of the more involved questions.
I have a question. I am Jaidev Singh Jolly. I am representing SJ Group of Companies. An idea I may write across and I would like to share it. Whenever we talk about enabling India to become skilled, we think about, okay, if a person is 14 years of age or maybe 17 years of age, we have to train a skill. What can we do to create, let us say, 100 Sachin Tendulkars and 1 lakh Lata Mangeshkars and 10,000 Sania Mirzas? An idea came when I was hearing Mr. Mohandas Pai that if we use Digital India to assess people, let us say, at the age of 8 or 10 on different skills, use that information again to do some assessment, freelancing done all over India at the age of 14. By the age of 16, most of the people will know what is their destiny, what they were made for, what is their core strength, and let's just meet it with something, and we can create Steve Jobs in India. We can create 1 lakh Sachin Tendulkars. Just an idea.
Yeah, it's good. Thank you. So, Madam, you had a question.
Yes, my My question is to Mr. Mohandas Pai. I'm actually worried about digital India because, nowadays when I employ a cook, he brings the mobile in the kitchen and I have to tell him that when you are cooking, you don't have to use, please put your phone away. Also, when the plumber comes or anybody, their attention is so very limited. They are more into seeing their mobile rather than doing the skilled work which they are supposed to be doing. Yeah, and even the nurses, I'm scared. When the electrician comes, I'm scared whether he's doing the work properly or not,
I don't know whether you had the experience of having a dentist answer the phone while drilling your teeth.
Yes, sir, it happened and he drilled on the wrong teeth, for which I'm still suffering.
I actually have
I totally agree with you. I totally agree. Just imagine you have a open heart operation and the doctor gets a call and he's, see, God help us. But I think there's a counter movement happening out to say that no email, no device for 3 hours fast, then there'll be a reaction. It'll happen in a period of time. There's a novelty right now, so you have to get over the novelty, but we need people like you to tell them not to do it.
I have a follow-up question that's kind of related to what ma'am pointed out. So I'm Devika Gupta. I'm from Citizens Alliance. We're a consultancy that's working with NSDC. So I recently graduated out of college, and since the question of education and digital India came up, I have to say that there is a resistance to the influence that digital India, the digital universe exerts on education. So in that context, I'd like the entire panel to reflect in the context of skill development. That's one. The second thing is the question of standardization. So Mr. Pai mentioned Khan Academy, but there's also indigenous outfits like Byju's and Udemy that are giving skilling courses. So how does the industry that's going to employ people who are skilled through these means, is it receptive at all to these certifications or recognitions? And if not, then what's the way forward?
Like I said earlier, the marketplace will find its own ways of doing things. And now because of Byju's, you find people actually learn, all right? And young people like you are very discontented, very angry and frustrated because the teachers, you know the answer before the teacher opens the mouth, because you Google, you get the answer. You know much more than the teacher. How do they keep you engaged? So the pedagogy has to change to make you understand that you must get information, use the information to do something, to actually think. So the pedagogy of one-way street where you push information is gone because the teacher can only push information. But how to use the information, where to use it is what you want to know, because you have the information better than anybody else. And if you don't have the information, put it on Quora and you get all the answers from all over the world, which even the teacher won't know, right? Now, this is a challenge, sir, that your students know much more than you, and you're teaching them something they don't want to know because they already know it or access to it, and they don't want to memorize that. So disruption is happening both ways. I think I agree with you. I don't have an answer, ma. The best thing is, we have thought of in our MOOCs courses, imagine a global university which, registers many people, like NSDL is doing, and you can do many digital courses, and you do 50 credits, they'll give you a degree. Right? That'll be very nice, right? And you can do it at home, anywhere. You can go to a physical place and take a course. You can do whatever you want. So your full freedom is focused on you. But our education is not focused on you, it's focused on the institution. And that's the sad part.
I think one more question here. We have decided, the panel has decided, they will take questions only from ladies. You have to stand between the lunch and now. So
okay.
Go ahead, madam.
I have a small one observation and a question. Going back to the gentleman who's just talked about government capacity. Is anybody mapping the capacity requirements in terms of government and their skills? What they require? I have seen a number of studies doing mapping for our private sector ones. I don't know if something for the government has been done, number one. Secondly, I know technology is a neutral word, but so long as we don't have level playing field, I don't think very many women-specific things are being talked about or also discussed. Women today, as on today, have specific needs and environment through which they can learn skills. We don't have enough discussion on those. Thank you.
The first question I'll request Mr. Sanjay Murthy to take, and the second question Mr. Sanjay Kapoor.
On the issue of the capacity of government to use IT applications, I'll just give you a small example. In my earlier posting in Himachal Pradesh, I was in the education department. There is an issue of giving scholarships to students in large numbers, which was all done manually. But in the state of Andhra Pradesh, you used to have 3,000 crore worth of scholarships distributed online. And it's a simple application developed by a Center of Good Governance there in Hyderabad. All it required was that application to be ported to the state. It had to reach out to the 2,000 odd schools there in real remote areas. You just had basic level of connectivity. A little bit of training which these guys gave at those centers. They came from Hyderabad, explained that application, and now they're also online. They're also transferring all these monies to those students online. Applications are received. So the question is, are we able to provide such type of applications for them to use, enabling them to do their work better? So I think the responsibility is not a question of training, but a question of giving them those applications, enabling them to use those things further.
Yeah, ma'am, your second question, I think with the whole digitization, the world actually is moving away from a very simplistic diversity management which is based on gender. It is no more about gender. I think it is about whether you belong to a data native category or a data immigrant category or a data alien category. And you need to fend for yourself, right? Because there are enough platforms and grounds that enable you to move yourself from one level to another level. Many of us, we were not born as data natives, but we run large companies or we've created large opportunities by actually becoming immigrants, right? We were not data natives, but we became immigrants over time. So we appreciate technology a lot better than many who are probably competing in the same arena. And that happened because we made the effort. And India will have to cater to even bring employability to people who are data aliens. Because at the end of the day, the longevity of the society is going up. You're going to live much longer than people lived 20 years back or 25 years back. You will need jobs for much longer. You will not retire at 58. How are you going to fend yourself till you are 85? It's going to be very difficult. So I think there will be room for everybody, but women or men, I think both have to realize that they need to use data natives around them to educate them. And every household today has a data native, right? Who can educate you, who can help you to come closer. If your question is that are there enough applications and services available for women, yes, they might be a trifle slow, but it is not that it's zero. It's not zero either. I think a lot is coming up in that area as well. And the whole idea is that if there is a bankable service that is available and it comes even from a data alien, it's good. You use the data natives to digitize that service and take it to masses. I think that's how the world is playing. The whole ecosystem is interfacing. But I guess everybody has to make efforts and don't wait for a woman to be treated differently from a male when it comes to digitization and digital India. Yeah.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, Mr. Chandrasekhar, Mohan, both the Sanjays. Thanks the audience. You actually made my work easy. It was so lively. And thanks to all the ladies who participated in the question. We were disappointed earlier. So Digital India has no gender barrier. That's what Mohan says, and I completely agree.
Digital India, gender is irrelevant.
Yes, so Digital India empowers everybody, whether you are a woman or man, child or old person, or a villager or a urbanite. Thank you so much.
On the internet, you can be a dog.
Yes. Yeah.
We now break for lunch. The lunch will be served in the banquet hall as well as the area outside the lobby area. We would request you all to please come back, join us for the session with the minister at 2 p.m. Thank you.
please welcome the Minister, Honourable Minister, please, with a round of applause.
May I request all the panelists also to kindly take your seats. Mrs. Kidwai, Mrs. Jayaraman, Mr. Mastu, and Mr. Takashahi. Kindly take your seats, please. Very good afternoon to all of you, and a warm welcome to the Honorable Minister, Dr. Kamal Hassan, and Mrs. Kidwai, and all the distinguished panelists for this afternoon session. Very, very interesting session, and Skills India for Make in India. Thank you very much, ma'am, for coming here. May I now request our President, FICCI, to welcome the Chief Guest Honorable Minister with a green certificate. May I now request Dr. Suri, the President FICCI, to provide her welcome remarks.
Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman, MOS, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India. Dr. Kamal Hassan, Chairman Media and Entertainment Sector Skill Council. Naina Lal Kidwai, past President FICCI and Group General Manager and Country Head HSBC. Mr. RCM Reddy, Chair FICCI Skill Development Forum. Takashi Toshide, Deputy MD India and South Asia Panasonic India Private Limited. Mr. Kishore Jayaraman, President India and South Asia at Rolls-Royce. Mr. Metsu, CEO IKEA. Please forgive me if I pronounced your name wrong. On behalf of FICCI, it is my privilege to welcome Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman to this function today. Compliments to you, Honourable Minister, for successfully driving the Make in India movement. A warm welcome to all delegates and speakers assembled here for the annual Skill Summit. Prime Minister Modi's invitation to business leaders, inviting them to come and make in India, has added impetus to the Skilled India mission with a view of creating approximately 100 million jobs by 2022, 100 million more jobs by 2022. While Make in India looks to boost manufacturing in India and create more jobs, Skill India aims to provide a job-ready human workforce to ramp up productivity and aid economic growth. Significantly, large number of employers have cited lack of trained manpower as one of the major concerns for their growth aspirations. Even if 1/4 of the proposed investments gets executed, the training infrastructure gap will be a huge challenge. Infrastructure in the country to meet the increasing demand of skilled workforce has to be enhanced. The private sector must join the government for the creation of this infrastructure. For instance, setting up of a multi-skilling development center may cost anywhere between 20 to 40 crores. If we plan one MSDC per district, the investment could go up to the tune of 20,000 crores. Ladies and gentlemen, a greater integration of the center, state, and all stakeholders is essential to drive the Skill India mission. I request you all to participate in this, and please sign on your way out to pledge and reconfirm your commitment towards nation building. Namaskar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And many of you have seen in the morning our young colleagues who are here who represented India in World Skills. 8 of them are here. And it will be great honor and privilege for them to be seen and recognized by Honorable Minister of State, Minister of Industry and Commerce. Ma'am, for your information, these young boys and the girl here represented India in World Skills competition. And the NSDC, National Skill Development Corporation, has coordinated and led this whole initiative. I request Atul Bhatnagar, the Chief Operating Officer of National Skill Development Corporation, to come here, coordinate this felicitation of the World Skills Medallion winners. Ma'am, may I request you kindly to come to the front, ma'am, so that you can give out certificates. Request Dr. Surya also to join, and Dr. Kamal Hassan kindly, sir. Atul. Request Dilip Shanoy also to kindly join there.
Good afternoon to you all. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce the winners who have brought India great laurels in the World Skills competition. Just a brief, World Skills is basically an Olympics in skills held every 2 years. This time it was held in Sao Paulo, and between 11th August and 16th August. India sent a team of 29 people participating in 27 disciplines. There are 59 countries that were represented there, and India brought in 8 medallions of excellence. Medallions of excellence means after the gold, silver, bronze, if your score is more than the world average and above 500 out of the 600 mark, then you get a medallion of excellence. So these people's feat is something we all need to be proud of, and we are here to felicitate them. So by name,